Okay, there's been a reissue of Velvet Kiss, Lick of the Lime. I'm just curious as to what prompted this. What prompted you to revisit this album and put it out again?
Well, uh, there's a few reasons, and it's sort of a happy accident that it's out at all. But one of the things that was a little I was miffed by was that you could open any streaming app and listen to just about anything that's ever been made. And so it's kind of a bummer when you're talking to somebody and you want to reference something that perhaps you've done and you open up Apple Music or Spotify or whatever, and it's not, it's zip. So there was the reason of like, it sure would be nice just to have it there, you know? I also have two teenage daughters. And so, they've grown up knowing that dad's a musician, dad's a producer, this is what he does. And they always hear references to this 80s thing that dad did. So there was the kind of like dad moment where I thought it'd sure be great to get this stuff out. And like all of us, we went through the pandemic and there was a lot of time to think
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and a lot of time to make plans to do things. And during that period, I was working on a soundtrack. I was doing a lot of sessions at home. And I ended up meeting my now manager, Jeff Keller. And at some point, he procured a record deal for me to basically give me my own label and let me do what I want. So we started making a laundry list of things that we would love to do. And sort of at the bottom of the list was, wouldn't it be nice just to get the Lines and Go stuff out there? There's a lot of extra tracks. I mean, I have reels and reels of demos and videos and stuff. And so we put it on the list. And as we were working on other things, he was able to get the rights for the first record. And I said, okay, well, let's run with that. So that's how we got to here. And it's nice to have it out in the world.
Yeah, sure. It was I mean, but sometimes I think revisiting these albums to remaster them, um, sometimes those production tropes of the 1980s,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
listen to them, and I mean, I've got albums in my collection that I used to love, but I just can't hear anymore because it just sounds so dated. And I'm just wondering,
What,
how did this
what,
album hold up?
what is the record you're referring to? I'm curious. The
Oh
one
well,
that you
actually,
can.
I'm referring to it. They're a British band. I don't know if you will have heard of them. They're a British band called Magnum, and they did an album in the late '80s, which I think was the worst time for. And I loved it when it came out, but I listened to it recently, and it
Uh,
just they just sound polluted these days. Some of these records, big roomy drumming and things like that on it. It's
yeah,
How did this album hold up when you heard it after all these years, considering it's a product of its time?
right. It's a great question, and I'm a big lover and consumer of music. So all my life, I've listened to music, loved music, listened to the production, been fascinated with how records are made. And I was a young guy when I made that record, not so young anymore. And at the time, it was interesting because we recorded that record in the UK, and
Yeah,
we did it in Soho at Tony Visconti's studio, The Good Earth.
right.
And Peter Walsh was the producer, and he'd made a lot of records with Simple Minds, Gene Loves Jezebel, Peter Gabriel. He made great sounding records. So
Yeah.
at the time, Peter's wife was pregnant, and he couldn't come to the States. And we'd already been in touch with Tony Visconti about working with us. So it was just a strange marriage of everything. And I remember how meticulous Pete was about making the record. And now revisiting it and getting ready to remaster it, I was pleasantly surprised that the
Okay.
production held up, and that the drums, they smelled of the 80s, but they didn't reek of the 80s, as it were. And
Yeah,
I know
yeah,
that the drum sound you're talking about, it's that big gated room reverb sound, and
yeah,
everything is sort of over the top.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's kind of a shame because a lot of great records were kind of ruined from that era. If you listen to stuff, which I'm sure you do, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, I feel like the 80s and 90s were a odd period of recording. There was a lot of mishaps that were happening, and they really have a stamp of those times. You know, there's lots of great stuff and a lot of great records were made. I mean, God, the Radiohead records and, you know, like all kinds of great stuff was made during this era. I love the whole catalog of Blur. And there's some great sounding records out there, but you're right. The 80s did ruin quite a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially the drum portions of the record seem really to suffer the most. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised at it. It still had a muscular quality to it. It had some finesse to it because of the strings. It wasn't completely over the top in reverbs, which was nice. And the original mastering was done by Bernie Grunman here in Southern California, who's worked on a ton of stuff, a lot of Tom Petty stuff, you know, and that was really great too. I just felt like when we went to remaster it, all I wanted was a little more air and a little more volume so that it could compete in the streaming world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting, you know, we talk about these production tropes. For me, the 80s are pretty bad, but I listened to some stuff from the late 60s, all those psychedelic flanged and wah-wah and crazy stereo panning. I love all that, even though it seriously dates it.
Yeah.
But the 80s for me, I just find it difficult to listen to that sort of stuff anymore.
Yeah, there's I have tons of records, and I was going through some stuff today because I just put a turntable in the studio, and I was listening to the first Talk Talk record. You remember that record?
Okay.
And in my mind, it sounded amazing.
Right.
And so I went, well, we're going to test the speakers and test the turntable. So I pull it out, I put it on, I went, something's wrong with the stereo. I'm not quite sure what it was, but it really wasn't. It was the production that was not pulled up in my mind. Like you, the Magnum record, you loved it and you thought that it's amazing. You put it on and you kind of went, oh, no, maybe not so much. I was listening to Thomas Dolby this morning, the Flat Earth record, and the production of that record is amazing. It sounds great. There's some really great records out there from the 80s. I'm doing a podcast later and they wanted to do my top 5 records. And I thought, well, that's cruel because you cannot pick 5 records. And this week, those 5 records would be different than next week.
Yeah.
And as I was pulling stuff out, I'm like, I'll pull out Duran Duran Notorious. I'll pull out Nile Rodgers, Adventures of the Good Groove, because they're all great production records.
Yeah.
But I've ended up pulling other stuff out and have that ready. But it's interesting, the different time periods and how some of the records hold up and some do not.
Yeah. It's interesting. Of course, Pink Floyd recently remixed their 1987 album, Momentary Lapse of Reason. And David Gilmour used the term, we've de-80fied it. You know, we've made it timeless now, not so much of a product of 87, but made it timeless. And I think a lot of bands might be on board with doing that sort of thing.
You know, it's interesting you brought that up. I can't remember what I came across the other day, but it was another similar situation where someone in the band said, we're re-releasing this record and we're remixing it for the same reason. And I love the record that you're referencing by Pink Floyd. I loved it in the 80s and I still love it. And I have not listened to the new remix, but I do have it.
Well, it's actually a Pink Floyd album now because the original album has no Nick Mason playing on it. And it was really just a Gilmour album. But now, Nick Mason plays drums on the whole thing. It's just,
I didn't know that.
It's a much better sounding album. He plays drums on the whole thing. They've added lots of Richard Wright keyboard parts.
Great.
It just sounds, it's like they've excavated it really, and it just sounds a lot better.
Oh, amazing. I'm definitely going to listen to it today then. That's a tonight and a glass of wine. Thank you for the recommendation.
Absolutely. Lions and Ghosts, I'm just curious, how did you come by that name? It seems it's a great name, but I'm just curious how you came by that.
Well, I think it's very indicative of that time period for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we were in a scene in Los Angeles that there was something and something, you know, there was Guns N' Roses, there was Love and Rockets, there was, I think, a lot of yin and yang names, really.
Yeah.
And the story of the name, I wish I had a really clever answer for you, but I inherited that name because I joined the band right after they had changed their name. They were a mod 3-piece in Hollywood. and they sort of changed their clearly changed their direction from mod, and they had just changed their name. And I auditioned, got in the band, and a year later we had a record deal. So I was super fortunate to sort of slide in there.
They were a mod band. Were they sounding, like the Jam and the Who and that sort of
Yeah,
stuff?
yeah, absolutely.
Oh wow,
Yes.
I should check
They were
those
called,
guys out then.
they were called Banner, and I don't think they ever released a record. There are demo tapes flying around, which I don't have. I gotta find that too.
Sure. Now you mentioned Guns N' Roses. I did some digging around, and am I right in am I right that you supported Guns N' Roses? Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
My word, you must have some interesting stories about that. Or are you saving them for your autobiography?
I'm saving them for when we're not on camera.
Well, nothing you can get sued over.
No, I mean it was an interesting time in Southern California because we had that whole hair metal scene happening.
Yeah.
And there was also a real sort of glammy thing that was even a little bit different than that. And then we had a post-punk scene. There was
Yeah.
a goth scene, and they were all intertwined. And it was the oddest thing because the Bills, in that time period, I guess people were like, well, this band will draw this band will draw this. And they just, put them all together, and they sold tickets. And I will tell you, I remember Guns N' Roses were always around. They're always running around Hollywood, just like us and all the other bands, putting up posters, handing out flyers,
Yeah.
trying to get people to come to the shows, always in the clubs, networking. And our manager at the time was really good friends with Vicky Hamilton, who managed Guns N' Roses then.
Yeah.
And they set up a bill, and we played at the Roxy on Sunset, right in the middle of the whole scene. And that night was a crazy night from sound check all the way until after. And that was the night that Guns N' Roses was signed to Geffen Records, and they announced it.
Right.
So I remember us thinking, well, the scene is vibrant. Bands are starting to get signed left and right. Here's this band, Guns N' Roses, that are this cool. At the time, they were way more Stones and sort of 70s glam than they really ended up being.
Yeah.
And I remember telling the guys, it's like, I can smell it, like it's going to happen for all these bands because we had a good draw, and you could sort of feel the excitement at shows. And I will never, ever forget that night for a bunch of different reasons that I can't say right now. But one of them announcing their signing was really special. And it was like, good for them. Everybody was really supportive of all the other bands, which is a great scene to have.
Yeah, I bet. I bet. Here's a question for you. Do you feel we live in an age where our music now is overcompressed?
Yes. Okay, I'll say that in two parts. Yes, it's seriously overcompressed.
Yeah.
And I enjoy it for the particular thing that's happening right now. The pop music, the Ariana Grande's, the Olivia Rodrigo, the Weeknd, all that stuff. I listen to all that stuff all day. I have twin 14-year-old daughters.
Right.
So our house is inundated with that. But I quite like it. I've worked on sessions in that. I produce stuff like that. I'm looking to sign artists like that on my label. So I enjoy it. But I agree with you. There's going to be a time 20 years from now that another you and another me are going to be having a conversation about how the overcompression ruined the music of the 2020s.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny, Neil Young went on a rampage against MP3.
Remember that?
He did a wonderful album. I can't remember when it came out, 2012, called Psychedelic Pill. And on that album, he made this great analogy between an MP3 file, listen to music on an MP3 file. It's like giving you a Picasso, but only allowing you to see a little square of it.
Yeah,
That's the analogy he made, really.
that was an excellent comparison to it. I remember his rants at the time of MP3s versus high res audio, which I'm a massive fan of and have been now for years. And I remember the whole adventure with the Pano player and
Yeah.
uh, all that stuff. It was a shame because I loved that he championed all that, and I know that he went in deep, and it was really sad when Pano stopped and the store stopped because it was
Right.
another great source of music,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
quality,
Go, sorry.
quality music, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, "Girl, I Love You." How did that single come about? And was it written for anybody? What was the inspiration for that song?
Well, first of all, it's a song that should not be. Um, there's no reason that it should have happened. First of all, I hadn't spoken to most of the guys in Lions and Ghosts in 20 odd years, and not for any particular reason other than life just gets in the way of some things. You know, you get married, you have kids, you go through divorce, you know, whatever it is. And I had a quick version of the story is I got an email to do a session for a guy here in LA. And I thought, fantastic. The songs are good. I'm going to do the songs at home, drink a cup of coffee, stay in my pajamas, and record. And then he promptly wrote me and said, no, we're going to do it at Rick Parker's studio, who's the singer of Lions and Ghosts, in Hollywood. And I went, oh, okay. So I ended up doing the session with Rick, and we had an amazing conversation,
Right.
completely therapeutic for me anyway, to be able to sit there and go through a lot of the stuff that we went through together because we spent a good portion of our youth together making music.
Yeah. Yeah.
So beyond that session, we started talking and we eventually got together just pre the pandemic, wrote that song, and then hit and missed each other for the next 2 years. And as the pandemic started lightening up, I was laying on the couch with COVID in a fever dream, and I grabbed my phone and I texted him. I said, "We got to finish this. We got to do it." So we got back together. We finished it up. I had my friend do a string session for it, and we got that out. And the inspiration for the song was, at first, it was just two guys sitting there with acoustic guitars, and we were both sort of having this moment that we never had when we were in the band, because in the band it was four people. We came in a room, everyone threw in their ideas, and you sorted it all out. This was one guy sitting in front of another guy with acoustic. What about this? Humming melodies. And that was a real old fashioned way to write a song, and really a big uh, breath of fresh air because of the pandemic and not being
Yeah.
around anybody, right? So
Yeah.
that happened. And then as we were listening to the mix, and Rick was talking to me about the mix, I said, no, I think that it sounds great. Well done on the mix. And he said, it's really strange. It sounds like Lions and Ghosts. And I looked at him, I started laughing. I'm like, what did you expect it to sound like? It's what you and I have done for years together. Of course it does. And he actually told me that at first he had written about something different, had a different title, and he changed it all. And in the end, he said, the inspiration for this was you and the people in your life.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
So it was very sweet.
Yeah.
We
Well,
also said, we also said that, like all lyrics, it's up for interpretation, and it's a lot like a Bowie lyric. Well, what does it mean to you? Because I'm writing it for you, and that's the way Rick is too. He was the same way. It's just vague enough so that maybe it works for you, and it works for this person and this person.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned COVID, of course, the pandemic. I
Oh,
managed to get COVID twice, actually.
I'm
I
with you.
always I always say that I enjoyed it so much the first time. I went for another go. But it's interesting that pandemic. It spawned a whole genre that I think years to come will be seen as the lockdown albums. A whole genre.
Yeah,
The McCartney album, I think the Foo Fighters album,
right, right.
quite a few, not off the top of my head, that were the result of being everything shutting down. Really, it was quite
Yeah,
interesting.
I think I've talked to a lot of musicians, and a lot of musicians flourished during that era. They
Yeah,
wrote a lot, they recorded by themselves, they taught themselves things. I think it was really helpful for a lot of people. I've also met some musicians that completely shut down and locked down. I have some friends didn't leave the house, didn't go in the studio,
yeah,
didn't write because, whether it was fear of becoming really sick on top of something they may already have been having, it's interesting, but mostly I'm with you. I think there was a big lockdown album thing. The McCartney is a great example of that, a very creative record where once again he made a whole record by himself.
Absolutely. Well, it's McCartney 3. It's the third one he's
Yeah.
done like that, isn't it?
Uh,
Well, you mentioned Bowie. I don't know if you're a huge Bowie fan, but
I am.
working with Tony Visconti, I mean, that must have been kind of special. And how did that come about exactly?
That's it was beyond special because, I grew up in an era where a big portion of my consumption was Bowie and T-Rex, and that was a big thing for me. In fact, as we have just sitting right there,
Okay.
right? Um, yeah, all of us in Lions and Ghosts were all big Bowie T-Rex fans, and we covered quite a few T-Rex songs. And, when we got signed, we made the dream team list of people we'd love to work with.
Yeah.
And Tony Visconti was one of the guys. And I can't remember really in 1985 or six exactly what Tony Visconti was doing. I'm sure he was quite busy, but we approached him and he could not or didn't want to work with us. One of the two, I don't know which it is. And we ended up working at his studio. So we saw him every day for almost 3 months. And
Right.
at some point, he came into the control room while we were working and said, I'd love to do some string arrangements for you guys. And I mean, gobsmacked, yes, right? Our jaw was on the ground, eyes big as saucers. And so that is in a time period where a guy, an arranger goes away, writes an arrangement, and you say, okay, string date is on Tuesday, November 14th. Nobody's heard it except for the arranger in his head, right?
Right.
It's not a MIDI days where now we can go and have somebody do a string arrangement for us and kind of get an idea of how it's going to work. So, I mean, probably one of the biggest events in my life as a musician was sitting in the Gooder studios watching, God, I don't know how many pieces there were. I want to say that it was like a small, not a quartet, not an octet, a bit bigger. And it's Tony just out there leading this through. And every note was a surprise. And not once did I ever think, oh, that's odd. I mean, everything was just like, wow. And we have a song on that album called When the Moon is Full.
Okay.
And when the guitar solo came, the strings came in and doubled the guitar part, which is such a T-Rex moment.
Yeah.
And I was on top of the world. I'm like, that's right. That's me. And that's Tony Visconti and the strings. It was amazing. It was a great time. And he was a real gentleman, really nice, really supportive. The studio, I mean, I never wanted to leave. It was so great. 3 months in Soho in that studio working. We had a regular schedule too, as a proper schedule. Get there at 10. And then that was back when there was the break in the middle of the day where the pubs were closed and then would reopen. Studio would just empty out and go across the street on Dean Street and have a beer, come back and finish up, and then we come back the next day. It was great.
But you do know Soho has a very seedy reputation in London.
Yes, I do know that.
Is that another story for your autobiography?
Oh my God, there's many stories there. We were staying in Soho Square, right down the street, right above MPL. So it was, yeah, it was a lot to take in, especially 1985, 86.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was going up to London quite frequently at that time because there used to be a record shop called Shades Records. I think it was in Soho, but you used to go down into this basement. It was mainly hard rock and stuff like that. But in their back room, they were selling vinyl bootlegs. And I used to go to the back room and buy Kiss bootlegs because that's what I enjoyed at the time. It was a great little shop. Great. I don't know what happened to it or where it's gone. Right. Interesting. You mentioned Bowie. The other day I was listening to Iggy Pop's album "Lust for Life."
Yeah,
it's got Bowie all over it. The way it sounds and everything.
Oh yeah,
it almost sounds like, to me, almost sounds like Sound and Vision, that album. But it's fabulous.
Yeah, it's those two records that Bowie did with him that really are I mean, they couldn't be more Bowie. The production, the arrangements, the kind of background vocals, those are both two amazing records. And the Sales Brothers playing, bass and drums on that,
Yeah,
incredible. Later,
absolutely.
Tin Tree.
Yeah, yeah. Um, when I was a young lad, about 16, I used to like to watch the Bangles for the obvious reasons.
Yes, I know.
And you've worked with Susanna Hoffs.
Yeah.
Is she as gorgeous in real life as she is on my posters?
I think maybe more gorgeous in real life.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And she's also, to be real honest, she's also gorgeous on the inside. I mean, she's such a sweet, angelic person. And I met her right as she was finishing her first solo record that I think came out in London. And I think I got a call to be in her video, and I hadn't played on the song, but her manager knew me from working with Amy Mann. So he called
Oh,
me
okay.
and I went down there and we hit it off right away. She couldn't have been sweeter. And we spent the day in a very hot, sticky downtown LA neighborhood.
Okay.
Talk about Soho being seedy.
Yeah.
And we got on really well. And we ended up going on the road, mostly just the two of us, which was fascinating. It was both of us with acoustic guitars. We did one proper gig in London on a boat on the Thames, which was bizarre and fun. And then we did a whole European press thing, just the two of us, Japan. So we had a really great run together. And I mean, yeah, beautiful. It was a easy job.
I bet it was. I bet
It
it
was
was.
easy on the eyes and easy on the everything.
Yeah. Certainly easy on the ears. I think she's got a beautiful voice,
Yeah.
hasn't she?
Gorgeous voice. Yeah, yeah.
Um, while you were recording The Wild Garden, you two were in the same studio apparently, recording their Rattle and Hum album. Have you got any interesting U2 stories about them? Were you aware of them being there? Were they aware of you?
Uh, yes and yes.
Okay.
The studio then was A&M Studios, and
Yeah.
that's like right in the heart of Hollywood. It's now Henson's, and it's amazing studio, and it was owned by Herb Alpert and
Okay.
I think Jerry Moss, because they're the A&M guys. But boy, the studio was full with like Shelley Yakis and all these Jimmy Ivy and all these really great engineers and producers. And so there's about 5 or 6 rooms, three
Yeah.
of which are massive, and then there's some smaller rooms. And we booked, I think, 2, 3 weeks in sort of a medium studio in the front with Tom Panunzio, who had worked with John Lennon and came from New York and worked at the record plant for years. And it was us and Tom, and we were just starting the record. Well, it was clear to us in a day
Yeah.
that it was us and them,
Okay.
and they were occupying every studio but ours. So you had Bono working in vocals in one studio. You had is it Larry Mullins,
Yeah.
the drummer, right? He
Yeah.
was in one room tracking something. They were all split up, and they also had one of the rooms set up for them to play live and work stuff out. And when they weren't around, of course, we were interested, so we went in and looked to see what they were up to and what gear they were using. But they were in there day and night, all of them at different times, working on different stuff. And the only two stories I really have is there was an interaction of I was working on a guitar part and I worked on it for hours and hours and hours. And some walls are thin in his studio. And at some point, when I happened to be standing having a drink out of the studio, they were down the hall talking about that fucking Keith Richards guitar part. And that was my part that was over and over. I think the song was Arson and Toyland, the beginning one. And it was an open tuning thing. And I just kept looking for the right tone. And anyway, they're complaining about it down the hallway. That was my one U2 story. And then the other one is I thought was really fascinating was they had been working on one of the singles from the record, and it was I think it was Angel of Harlem. And apparently everybody had mixed the song. Jimmy Iovine, Chelyakis, all the big wigs there had all had their hand at mixing. And I saw a ritual happening. A mix would happen, and then the guys from U2 would go out to a car and listen to it in the car.
Yeah.
And then they'd come back in. And so apparently they'd been working on that song for weeks and they hadn't found a mix. And across the hall, there's a very, very tiny studio, and it was where the Carpenters cut all their records.
Okay.
And there was this young assistant engineer. His name was Rob Jacobs.
Okay.
And Rob was kind of the T-boy, right? You know, he would run, get all the drinks and the food for everybody, and then he'd help set everything up. Well, apparently late one night, he did his own mix of Angel of Harlem.
Yeah.
And that's the version now that we all listen to. He had to play it for his boss the next day, apparently. And who knows what the politics were of all that. But it was great. Here's a 19-year-old kid who, after hours, mixed the song. And that's the mix that you and I all know now.
That's fabulous. Does he get a credit on the album?
I believe he does. Yeah, I haven't looked in ages. But at the time, I was so happy for him because he's such a great guy. And I mean, he's done really well for himself. But, you know, it was really cool because we were friends with him and he was, you know, he was up and coming.
This is a question that I ask everybody, really. It's Gene Simmons says rock is dead. To what extent do you think he's correct?
Well, you know, I often like to say that, but I don't actually believe it, to be honest. I don't think rock is dead, and I don't think it ever will be dead. I just, there's a spirit in rock and roll that I know you know in your heart that is always there. And it's there for lots of kids, whether they're listening to, I don't know, you know, some sort of some band. I'm just trying to think of a good example of it, but you know, there's lots of new bands. What is it? Moleskin, Maneskin, that band. Do you think they think rock is dead? I don't think so. There's a lot of bands out there, even if it's not the rock that you and I know. Maybe it's not UFO. Maybe it's not Thin Lizzy. Maybe it's not Kiss. Maybe it's not Guns N' Roses. It's still rock, and it still has a spirit of rock and roll. You know, I don't think that.
I think in Gene's defense, because he'll probably be calling me before long, the amount of times I keep mentioning him in these interviews. In Gene's defense, I think he said I think he feels that it's the music business, the infrastructure is not there, and the investment in new bands isn't there. There's not going to be another Beatles or another Who, he says.
I don't think so. I'll agree with your opinion completely. I think that is true. The music business as it was will never be again. Yeah. It's just not going to happen. Nobody's going to take the time to develop an artist. We're not going to see the same sort of thing that we saw with the Beatles or the Stones or even Kiss. Like that kind of stuff, it just isn't going to happen. I grew up in that era. I was a massive Kiss fan, and I saw that all roll out. I saw it all happen. You don't see that now. It's a hit or two here or there, but you don't see, like, the last of that for me was the Killers and Radiohead and bands like that that really had a proper sort of time to exist and to grow and to breathe and to change. That can't happen now. Nobody has the attention span for it either.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think Gene's right. And I met Gene Simmons at A&M Records years after the U2 thing. I was recording a record with Amy Mann called Lost in Space. And the string session, we were standing out there and Gene was sitting there and I was beside myself because I was such a huge Kiss fanatic. And I remember the whole time, he didn't want to talk to me. He wanted to flirt with Amy. That's all he did the entire time we were there.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, really. I mean, you know, this lack of investment or allowing bands to breathe and develop. I mean, I just think we talked about Pink Floyd earlier. I think in this day and age, Pink Floyd would never have got to the point where they would have made Dark Side of the Moon because there wouldn't have been that investment in them. I don't think. And also, you know, can you imagine? I mean, you think about bands that are like iconic, like Stones and the Who and the Beach Boys. Who are those iconic names? Another 20 years down the road, who are those big iconic names? Do you think who that will still be?
That's a great question. I mean, you know, is it going? It's funny now that I listen to classic rock radio. I find that very fascinating because they're sort of dictating what will be remembered. And they're skipping over large portions of things that shaped a lot of people's lives and was the soundtrack to your life or my life. I don't, when I listen to, we have satellite Sirius XM here. So I listen to a lot of the different decade channels. I don't hear a Kiss song, and I rarely hear a Peter Frampton song. I may hear Money by Pink Floyd. That might be it, or Stairway to Heaven, but that certainly doesn't represent what was really happening on radio or what was going on at the time. So I'm worried that history is going to get changed to some extent from what we really know it to be. And 20 years from now, I don't know that they're going to say, oh my God, the Weeknd's fourth record was, the Dark Side of the Moon of our era. I don't know. There's a lot of new records that I listen to, and some of them stick, and then some I just move on from. It will be interesting what my kids think is classic 10 years from now, because I see them devouring stuff so fast and it's really disposable. And a lot of it is Taylor Swift. I bet you someone like Taylor Swift will actually stay the test of time. I think in 20 years she'll still be remembered because she has a big body of work. She works really, really hard, like her or not. So I don't know what else is going to be in there. Is it going to be Muse? I love Muse. They're a great band, right? And they make great records. But will people know? And I think people will remember Radiohead. I think that will be a classic for the time. I'm hoping Blur and Oasis will somehow still be remembered 20 years from now. God bless them all.
Even for the fights, I think they'll be
Even for the fights, that's right.
It's funny. To sound pessimistic, I read somewhere that someone said in 50 years' time, the only artists that will be remembered will probably be Bob Dylan and the Beatles. That's quite bleak, isn't it?
It's really bleak, and it could very well be true.
Uh-huh.
It's strange because what happened to the people before them that created them?
Well, we lost Jerry Lee Lewis recently, didn't we?
I know. It's very sad, but like all those guys, that era is drying up. The 60s era people are drying up. But the Beatles wouldn't be the Beatles without Elvis Presley or without Little Richard or without Jerry Lee, all these great people. So it's sad when I talk to younger people about music because their education of how we got here is really underfed. That's why my kids and I talk to them. We talk about music constantly in the car, and they'll play me old songs that they've heard in a movie or a TV show. And then I'll say, well, did you know that so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that? And the reason they did that was because of this. I just feel like you got to pass that torch on to the kids.
You got to try anyway, I think. I mean, you mentioned Elvis. Another question that I always ask is, in the history of popular music, which album do you think was most important? The Elvis debut, or Sergeant Pepper by the Beatles?
Well, you'll get a different answer from a lot of different people, won't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a tough one because I love the debut of Elvis. I mean, it's groundbreaking. And at the same time, Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis and Johnny Cash, all those guys made groundbreaking records. But the one that's going to be remembered is Elvis because he probably became the biggest entertainer that this planet will ever know. And he influenced so many people. Without him, once again, there'd be no Sgt. Pepper's without Elvis, which is weird to say, but I have to believe it's the truth because they wouldn't have had their beginnings. They wouldn't have had their chance meeting with Bob Dylan. They wouldn't have smoked that first joint. Yeah. They would, there's such a progression to getting to Sgt. Pepper's. But for me, Sgt. Pepper's is far more influential because when I got interested in music, it was the Beatles that did that. So for me, I see that as a groundbreaking record for them. It's not my favorite Beatles record, but it's iconic as hell. And it laid the groundwork for a lot of great records.
Yeah, I read the autobiography of James Brown, and he says Elvis Presley was just a hillbilly that discovered the blues. It's quite a funny story, but obviously Elvis was much more than that. But it's still a funny little thing, really.
Yeah.
I think that's all my questions all dried up. I'm gonna go and put the kids to bed now.
Oh, I know that. How many kids do you have?
Three. I've
Oh,
got a 13-year-old that she doesn't communicate anymore. She just mopes about the house now. I call her Mopey Dick. And I've got two small ones. My son is 8, and my little daughter is 6. So they're
oh,
still interested
nice.
in.
Oh,
in
you're blessed. You're blessed
I
and
am.
cursed. You're cursed for the teenage years, but you're blessed to have that joy from the young ones for sure.
Well, the teenage girl, her and I share, we watch TV together. We both like Stranger Things, and she's been introduced
Oh,
to lots
love
of
it.
great music through that
Yeah.
program, Metallica and Kate Bush, and lots of 80s music, which, it's kind of opened up her. We talk about passing that torch
Yeah.
on.
And
And
that is the same for my daughters as well. It's true. I mean, here Kate Bush went back on the charts. And for me, that was amazing because I'm a massive Kate Bush fan and I love that record. And it really, that song, it's amazing. That song is the thread through the whole last season. And I just found that to be incredible. And my kids, too, really identified with a lot of that music. Now we're listening to a lot of Journey all of a sudden,
okay.
you know?
I got to see Kate Bush in London a few years back, and it was one of the most lavish, ornate shows I've ever seen. It was absolutely fantastic. Which is the best Kate Bush album then?
Well, I have a big soft spot for the first record, The Kick Inside, because that's where I discovered her. And she played on Saturday Night Live here. And I remember her crawling around the piano. I obviously fell in love with that woman, And so that I have a soft spot for that. I love Lionheart. I like the early records a lot. I still was a big fan of Hounds of Love. I mean, I'm maybe burnt out a little bit on Make a Deal with God because I hear it all day on the radio and then my
Yeah.
kids play it all day in the house. So,
Make a
but
deal with God never to hear that record again.
yeah. But I'm so pleased for her to have that sort of resurgence. How nice is
Oh,
that?
my favorite album by her has, I mean, I love all that early stuff like you, but my favorite album is The Dreaming. I think that's a
Oh,
remarkable,
that's a beautiful record. Yeah.
absolutely. Anyway, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure
Nice to meet you,
speaking
Barry.
with you. The Velvet Kiss Lick of the Lime, is that actually out now? Is it? Is that available to
It,
find
it
now?
is. It's out in high res, so you can get it in
Okay.
24-bit on
Yeah.
Koba's Tidal. It's streaming in high res. There's extra tracks. There's a bunch of there's 2 B-sides on it, and I think 4 dance tracks that were originally remixed in the 80s. And that's kind of fun stuff. Now that sounds super dated, and I love it.
Well, I will certainly dig out a purchasing link, and I will put the purchasing link just below this video.
Very
So
nice. Thank you.
thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day
I
and
will.
enjoy your breakfast. And
Yeah.
best of luck anyway. Thank you
Yeah.
very
Thank you, Barry. Good luck with everything.
much. Okay, all the best. Bye bye.
Bye.